Okay, everybody. I want to welcome you. I'm Maurice Samuels, the director of the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism, and along with my conference co-organizer, Sam Moyne, I want to say welcome to the second day of the conference on anti-Semitism and the crisis of liberalism, sponsored by the Yale program for the study of anti-Semitism. We have an exciting full day today, starting with this panel on Theorists of Liberalism and the Jewish Question, coffee break, followed by a panel on illiberalism and what it means for Jews, another panel after lunch on American liberals and Zionism, followed by a final roundtable with several distinguished journalists. So I gave some opening remarks yesterday, and I won't repeat them, but I do want to take the opportunity to again thank our sponsors. So the conference is made possible by generous grants from the Edward J. and Dorothy Clark Kempf Memorial Fund at the Betty McMillan Center for International Studies at Yale, the Jason M. Folk Memorial Fund at the Yale Program for the Study of Anti-Semitism, and with support from partners across the university, including the Center for the Study of Race, Indigeneity, and Transnational Migration, the Jewish Studies Program, the Department of French, and the Whitney Humanities Center. I want to remind those watching remotely that they may ask questions using the Q&A function, and we will relay them to the panelists. So please, you can ask questions at any time during the panel, and we will ask them at the end. We have actually plenty of time allotted for questions, so I really encourage the audience to participate. We had a fantastic discussion yesterday afternoon, and I look forward to more of that today. I know that many of the issues we are going to be discussing are contentious ones, and I also want to remind everyone that Yale is committed to protecting free expression and peaceful dissent. Interfering with the speaker's ability to speak and the audience's ability to hear and see is not consistent with the university's free expression policy and will not be allowed. We encourage the audience to ask questions of our panelists, but we request that they be concise and that they be actual questions. Okay, now without further ado, I turn it over to our chair, Seyla Benhabib.
Thank you, Mark. Good morning, everyone. And thank you to Maurice and to Samuel for having put together such an incredibly exciting and timely program. I will introduce everybody in the panel right now, and I will start with Stephen Smith, Alfred Kaus, Professor of Political Science at Yale, my colleague. He's the author of many books and started writing on Spinoza very early, actually, in his career, but he most recently wrote Reclaiming Patriotism in an Age of Extremes. Then, following Stephen, will be Ronnie Grinberg, who is Associate Professor of History and core faculty member of the Schusterman Center for Judaic and Israel Studies at the University of Oklahoma. She's the author of Write Like a Man, Jewish Masculinity and the New York Intellectuals, published by Princeton University Press in 2024, listed for the National Book Critics, a Circle Award, and a finalist in the categories for the National Jewish Book Award. And following Ronnie will be Rebecca Kobrin, who is Russell and Bettina Knapp Associate Professor of American Jewish History at Columbia University. She's also the director of Columbia's Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies, and she works in the fields of American Jewish history, immigration studies, business history, and urban studies. Aside from her scholarship, she's also one of the lead investigators of the award-winning Digital Humanities Historical New York City project. Then we have Malachi Hacohen, who is Professor of History, Jewish Studies, and Religion at Duke University. His research interests focus on Central Europe, the Jewish intelligentsia and rabbinic culture. He's the author of Karl Popper, The Formative Years, Politics and Philosophy in Inter or Vienna, and Jacob and Esau, Jewish European History Between Nation and Empire. And he's presently working on a book called Kurban, Catastrophe in Jewish History. So let me say, I'm really looking forward to this panel, and I was thinking to myself, what is the Jewish question really? Why is it a question? Whose question? Is it a theological question? Is it a political question? Is it a cultural question? Is it a question about modernity? And it's all of the above. But we should put a question next to the question mark as well. So I look forward to learning from all of you this morning. Stephen, the floor is yours.
I'm going to stand up for this. It's on. We're good? Yeah. I lecture in this room in the Directed Studies program, so it feels unnatural for me to sit down. But I want to thank Seyla for those lovely introductory remarks, and also not only the organizers of the panel, but the participants who got up so early in the morning to come to this. I can think of no more important or timely problem or question today than the issue of anti-Semitism and the crisis of liberalism. But let me begin with a confession. When I was approached by Maurice to contribute to a panel called Liberalism and the Jewish Question, I was shocked, not to say repelled, by the title of the panel. In the first place, the term Jewish question, even if put in the ironical quotation marks, carries the suggestion that Jews or Judaism, as Seyla suggested, carries some kind of stigma that must be overcome if they, or can I say we, are to find our proper place in society. And second, the term Jewish question, as we sort of heard yesterday, has been mainly a European problem. To ask an average American about their views on the Jewish question would be met with utter incomprehension. And I could do no more, or no better rather, than to quote the sublime words of our first president addressed to the Jewish congregation at Newport, Rhode Island. It is now, he wrote, no more that toleration is spoken of, as if it was by the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States gives to bigotry no sanction and to persecution no assistance. May the children of the stock of Abraham who dwell in this land continue to merit and enjoy the goodwill of the other inhabitants, while everyone shall sit in safety under his own vine and fig tree, and there shall be none to make him afraid. I can think of no European statesman who dared to utter such a statement. And in this case, as in many, many others, America remains the exception and not the rule. The term Jewish question is not the same as anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism, or anti-Judaism, as I prefer to call it, is the oldest prejudice. As we are told, the sons of Amalek will arise in every generation. But if anti-Judaism is an ancient prejudice, the Jewish question is something entirely modern. I am not sure who coined the term, but it was debated most widely in Germany, where it was argued that Jews could only become members of the German state if they agreed to give up their Jewish identity. The term came to be most famously associated with Karl Marx's essay Zur Judenfrage. I always think the term sounds better in its original German somehow, which argued that society cannot be free from capitalism until it is free from Jews. Whether from the nationalist right or the socialist left, the Jews were seen not simply as a, but the stumbling block to the achievement of their visions of social and political emancipation. But I was able to overcome my prejudice about the title of the panel when I realized that its source derives from a truly great man. I refer, of course, to the 17th century Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza. Although Spinoza never used the term Jewish question, his book, The Theological Political Tractate, published in 1670, was the first work of European philosophy to put the question of Judaism front and center. And for this reason, I consider Spinoza to be the father of the term. Spinoza was a descendant of those Iberian Jews who fled first from Spain and then from Portugal to avoid the Inquisition, and who found a home in the relative freedom and toleration practiced in the Netherlands. Holland had recently achieved its independence from Habsburg Spain and had become a haven of both religious and commercial liberty. Spinoza is best remembered, when he is remembered at all, for his expulsion from the Jewish community at the age of only 24 years old. The reasons for his expulsion remain vague, but they are not so difficult to guess at. He had clearly begun to question the laws of the Torah and to consider how Jews might best be able to adapt themselves to the condition of the modern Dutch Republic. It remains one of the embarrassments of modern intellectual history that virtually everything the French philosophes of the next century knew or thought they knew about Judaism, they actually learned from a Dutch Jew. So there. The Theological Political Tractate is a work of extraordinary erudition. It is also an opening salvo of the Enlightenment's war on orthodoxy, by which I do not mean only Jewish orthodoxy, but religious orthodoxies of all kinds. He would provide the ammunition for a notorious French anti-Semite named Arouet, we heard about him yesterday, who would take as his slogan, "Écrasez l'enfant," or crush the infamy. Yet the gist of Spinoza's critique of religion, while purportedly devoted to religion in general, focused on Judaism in particular, which he depicted as a body of superstitions and false beliefs that cannot stand up to the application of critical investigation. With relentless logic and coruscating sarcasm, he undermined the very pillars of Jewish belief and practice. In his work, Spinoza took up such controversial topics as the divine inspiration or the merely human character of Scripture, the reality or impossibility of miracles, the immutability or historical situatedness of the Mosaic Law, and the creation or the eternity of the world. But the question most relevant to our topic today is Spinoza's views on what he called the election or the chosenness of the Jewish people. In the third chapter of the tractate, he asked the question whether there can be a people chosen to fulfill an appointed destiny. And his answer was an emphatic no. Spinoza was what we would call today a moral universalist. There is no such thing, he argued, as a people chosen by God in respect of their moral and intellectual qualities. Such qualities are distributed more or less randomly among all the peoples of the earth. So to say that one nation is chosen over another is nothing more, he argued, than a mark of national vanity or a desire to lord it over others. Moreover, Spinoza ridiculed the idea that Jewish survival over the centuries, something we addressed yesterday, had anything to do with God's favor. It had less to do with divine providence than with the hatred of the Gentiles, which helped keep the Jewish people intact, but also left them a persecuted community. The conclusion reached by Spinoza is the belief that divine election is not a theological blessing, but a political curse. It is at the root of what would be called today discrimination. And his answer to this problem was a simple one. If Jews are to avoid discrimination, they must cease to be recognizable as Jews. They must adapt themselves to the practices and habits of their host countries, or in a word, become invisible to their fellow citizens. This is an early version of a thesis we heard yesterday by the French figure Clément Tonnerre, who said that for the Jews as a people, nothing; for the Jews as individuals, everything. Let me put it another way. Jews, for Spinoza, must cease to be a covenanted community based on their laws and tradition, but become a religion, in the sense of a sect like any other that achieves toleration in the context of a liberal state. This is the basis of the statement, that later statement, of course, it wasn't Spinoza's, that one may be a Jew at home, but a man in the street. It is not necessary to convert in the manner of a Felix Mendelssohn or a Heinrich Heine, but one must shave one's beard, clip one's side locks, remove one's skull cap, take off one's gabardine, in order to achieve full social and political emancipation. On the whole, this can be called the assimilationist solution to the Jewish question. Yet this is not Spinoza's only word on the subject. He was also the first modern thinker to advocate for the restitution of Jewish sovereignty and a Jewish state. At the end of the chapter I have been considering, he wrote the following sentence, and I quote him: "Were it not that the fundamentals of their religion had effeminated their minds, I would not hesitate to believe that they will one day, given the opportunity, such as the mutability of history, establish their independent state, and God will bless them anew, or a second time." Here Spinoza considers the possibility of the creation of a Jewish state, the first since the Kingdom of Solomon, as an alternative solution to the problem of anti-Judaism. He does not say that such a state would have to be established in the historical land of ancient Judea. Such a state, from his point of view, could just as easily reside in Canada or Kathmandu. But on the basis of this remarkable passage, Spinoza was deemed a kind of proto-Zionist and accorded the status of an honorary founding father of the State of Israel. I should also mention that what Spinoza meant by this remarkable statement about effeminating the Jewish mind, he meant by that phrase the age-old trust in God's providence instead of belief in one's own powers of political organization and mobilization. The Jewish state would not be identical with the Messianic kingdom to be achieved through prayer and that would come only at the end of days, but it would be brought about here and now by purely mundane means, that is, by statecraft. Whatever the differences later on between labor Zionism and revisionist Zionism at the birth of Israel, both would agree with Spinoza that the Jewish state would only be possible on the strength of Jewish arms. Both Ben-Gurion on the left and Jabotinsky on the right were in this respect children of Spinoza. But this utopian belief that the creation of a Jewish state might help to normalize Jewish life, to put an end to homelessness, to put an end to the Jewish question, has unfortunately been massively undermined by the facts. It may have modified anti-Judaism in some particulars, but it has also been the cause of a major resurgence of anti-Semitism of the kind we have witnessed on college campuses throughout the country. Perhaps some believe that it is not anti-Judaism as such, but simply an unpopular right-wing government that is the cause of the conflict, and that if only a different government willing to support a two-state solution were elected, that this would bring an end to the anti-Jewish protest movements. But this is wishful thinking of a dangerous kind. It is not against this or that policy of the Israeli state that the protests are organized, but against what is deemed a white settler colonial state, a term that Adam Kirsch has done so much to help to explicate. It is the very existence of the Jewish state that is deemed an abomination. Let me conclude. The belief that the Jewish question can be solved is itself based on a delusion. It is based on the false premise that for every question, there must be a solution. There must be one right answer. I disagree with this premise entirely. The Jewish question is an example of one of those absolute, infinite questions that cannot be solved by purely human means. This does not mean that we should cease to try or that some solutions are not better than others. It only means that if the Jewish people are the chosen people, they have been chosen to show that there will never be a society free of contradictions. As Benjamin Disraeli wisely observed, finality is not the language of politics. Whatever may have been Spinoza's delusions about the future of Judaism, he approached the question with boldness and honesty that is characteristic of only truly great minds. It is a blessing for us that Baruch Spinoza lived and wrote. Thank you.
The mic's still on, right? You can hear me? I also want to thank the organizers. I'm really beyond honored to be here, so thank you to Sam Moyne and to Ronnie Samuels for putting together this amazing series of conversations. So in preparing for this conference, a friend mentioned a 2020 edited volume, Jews, Liberalism, and Antisemitism, which several of the participants here contributed to, including Samuel Moyne, James Leffler, and my co-panelist, Professor Hacohen. Now, I only wish I had known about this volume, and especially Hacohen's essay, which is titled The Jewishness of Cold War Liberalism, before my own book came out last year. I didn't have the gumption, or I don't know, the courage or the foresight to sort of, to say in what was my first book, as frankly as Hacohen did, that Jewishness was central to the making of Cold War liberalism. But I certainly agree. The Jewish origins of liberal anti-communism are palpable, he writes, in the works of European Jewish thinkers like Isaiah Berlin and Karl Popper, as well as a host of New York intellectuals, the group of prominent, mostly Jewish, mostly male writers and critics at mid-century America, who I'm going to focus on today. But historians had largely overlooked the Jewish dimensions of Cold War liberalism, Hacohen argued. Partly, and it wasn't entirely historians' fault, he said. Partly their own protagonists were to blame because most liberals carefully concealed the Jewish anxieties underlying their anti-communism and grounded their liberalism in universal fear, quoting from him. And religion also struck many of these secular thinkers as a feature of the past, as a residual marker of their ethnic identity. And notably, few women participated in the transatlantic networks that helped make Cold War liberalism, that centered largely on the Congress for Cultural Freedom, founded in June 1950, and its affiliate groups and journals. So Cold War liberalism, Hacohen deftly observes, remained largely the world of men. Now, certainly, the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, which was founded in December of 1950 as the American affiliate of the Congress for Cultural Freedom, operated as male space. So did many of the venues of the New York intellectuals, including the influential magazines they founded and edited, chief among them Partisan Review, first founded in 1934 under the auspices of the communist John Reed Club, but relaunched in 1937 as anti-Stalinist by editors William Phillips and Philip Rov. Commentary, founded in 1945 by the American Jewish Committee and edited until 1959 by Eliot E. Cohen. An Encounter, founded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom in London in 1952, and first edited by a young Irving Kristol and the British poet Stephen Spender. Now, Sidney Hook, who helped found the American Committee for Cultural Freedom and served as its executive chairman until 1955, wrote in his 1987 memoir that at the group's height, between 1952 and 1953, and here I'm quoting him, the membership list of the ACCF consisted of several hundred of the most distinguished men and women in cultural life, or the nation. But contrary to Hook's proclamation, barely a dozen women were ever members, and truly the only active woman in the group was Diana Trilling, the literary critic and wife of the famed Columbia University professor Lionel Trilling. She, alongside with several other New York intellectuals, served on the group's executive board. In 1956, Diana was elected chairman of the board, though not long after that, the group suspended operations after sort of the high tide of McCarthyism towards the end of the 50s. But the group revived briefly in 1959 to take over the publication of Partisan Review for tax-exempt purposes. That led to Diana's acrimonious resignation from the group. She took issue with its financial support of Partisan Review, a magazine that she felt by 1959 no longer took a stringent or hard, to use the lingo of the term, or the lingo of the period, anti-communist position. And Diana's resignation was met by vitriol in ways that are really hard to explain. William Phillips characterized Diana as crazy, while Bertram Wolfe suggested the board reject her resignation, demanding, and here I'm quoting him, that she ought to be asked to come to a future meeting and explain her position like a man. Now, the American Committee for Cultural Freedom was also conspicuously Jewish, certainly in terms of its leadership and those most involved and active in its activities. In 1952, Eliot Cohen, the editor of Commentary magazine, who played a really important behind-the-scenes role in the founding of the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, told the leaders of the American Jewish Committee at a board meeting that, and here I'm quoting him, almost every important Jewish writer, activist, scholar, university figure, or intellectual is not merely non-communist, but openly anti-communist. One need only examine, he continued, the list of the executive committee and the membership of the American Committee for Cultural Freedom, the US government-approved pro-democratic and anti-communist organization in the professional and intellectual fields. They are full of Jewish names, he told the AJC. Now, I use these two vignettes about the American Committee for Cultural Freedom to get at my remarks today, which focus on the intersection of gender and Jewishness in the lives of the New York intellectuals, and especially in their contributions to the making of Cold War liberalism. The New York intellectuals, as many scholars have pointed out, were central to defining Cold War liberalism as a mature ideology, bereft of any illusions when it came to the Soviet Union. No one seemed better equipped to undertake this mission, historian Richard Pell wrote as early as 1985, than the intellectual who had been exposed to the disease of communism in the 1930s and now was immune from further infection. Now, most of these figures had been Trotskyists who had become anti-Stalinists by the middle of the 1930s, and so they never supported the Popular Front, which the Communist Party initiated in 1935 and which lasted until the signing of the Nazi-Soviet Pact in 1939, and then sort of reemerges, I guess, when the US and the Soviets become allies. But in the words of Nathan Glazer, these figures were premature anti-communists. Now, the Popular Front would prove problematic for Democrats in the post-war era. So would the Jewish connection to radicalism. The New York intellectuals, through their involvement in the American Committee for Cultural Freedom and their journals, especially Partisan Review, Commentary, and Encounter in this period, would play a pivotal role in the post-war era, recasting liberalism as a toughened and masculinized ideology. I'm not the only scholar who sort of has talked about the masculine origins of Cold War liberalism, and severed from any connections to the Popular Front. And I argue that in the process, they would prove that Jews were not only loyal Americans, but properly manly in Cold War America.
No, it's not. Okay.
It's not mine, good thing. Okay, properly manly in Cold War America. So in the first half of the 20th century, many Jews had supported the labor movement, and many had been socialists. A visible minority were communists. And though most Jews cemented their allegiance to the New Deal and the Democratic Party in the 1930s, the stereotype of the radical Jew persisted in the post-war years. Now, stereotypes of anti-Semitic discourses, meanwhile, had long tied Jews also to subversion. Or anti-Semitic discourses, meanwhile, had long tied Jews not only to subversion, but to effeminacy. Stereotypes of Jewish men as unmanly, weak, passive, sissified, had long characterized anti-Semitic discourses on both sides of the Atlantic. For centuries, Western Christians viewed circumcision as the most obvious sign of Jewish feminization. By the late 19th century, such descriptions of Jewish male difference merged with discourses on racial and sexual inferiority. Homosexuals, as well as Jews, were both cast as sexual inverts at times, alternatively described as perverted, abnormal, mentally diseased, and even intellectually gifted. But intellectual prowess, too, was often seen as a sign of masculine deficiency in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, since the scholar was the opposite of the virile male athlete or a working class laborer. By the post-war years, the image of kind of the nebbish Jewish intellectual sissy type blended with the effeminate dandy and the communist dude, posing an acute problem for American Jews. As a second Red Scare swept the nation, it intersected with post-war anxieties about gender and sexuality. Concerns about a softened male self were widespread in the post-war years, as politicians, writers, and social commentators worried that emasculated men were unable to meet the challenges of the atomic age. These fears manifested in various discourses in the late 40s and 50s about suburban conformity, juvenile delinquency, and certainly about homosexuality. Homosexuals, real and imagined, were targeted as security threats in a lavender scare that was part and parcel of the Second Red Scare. And while politicians on both sides of the aisle conflated fears of domestic political subversion and foreign aggression with anxieties about the maintenance of a domestic sexual order, Republicans were especially aggressive, and Democrats, in some ways, were on the defensive. With the start of the Cold War, Republicans and Democrats wrangled over who was harder on communism. Now, terms like hard and soft, mature versus immature, had gendered connotations. In anti-communist rhetoric, hard signified toughness and resolve, as well as heterosexual virility, while softness denoted the opposite: timidity, weakness, effeminacy. The Republican-controlled House Un-American Activities Committee, HUAC, held widely publicized hearings on alleged communist subversion, gaining widespread traction when it targeted Hollywood, an industry with many Jews as cultural workers, and certainly tied to Jews in the American imagination. 6 of the so-called Hollywood 10, those who refused to answer HUAC's questions after invoking their First Amendment rights, which was an argument that the Supreme Court ultimately rejected, and that's when people started invoking their Fifth Amendment rights. But six of the 10 were Jewish. Now, in 1948, HUAC turned its attention to the State Department after Whittaker Chambers accused Alger Hiss, a former State Department official in the Roosevelt administration in the 1930s, of spying and passing secrets to the Soviets during that period. Republicans seized on the Hiss case to discredit Democrats as soft on communism. And they portrayed Hiss as an effete, cookie-pushing, Ivy League internationalist intellectual type, and tarred the entire liberal foreign policy establishment with the specter of communist subversion and homosexual perversion. Now, liberals responded to the charges of being soft on communism by brandishing their own anti-communist credentials. In March of 1947, President Harry Truman established a loyalty security program for government employees, while liberal groups like Americans for Democratic Action, founded that same year, worked tirelessly to discredit Hiss's brand of liberalism and to sever the Democratic Party from other progressive voices, especially Henry Wallace, FDR's former vice president, who had called for accommodation with the Soviet Union. In contrast to Wallace, Cold War liberals called for a chastened but emboldened liberalism that was tough enough to take on the Soviet Union. Arthur Schlesinger Jr.'s bestseller of 1949, The Vital Center, in which he characterized Wallace and his progressive supporters as weak-minded dough faces, provided one of the clearest and most explicit articulations of this new toughened Cold War liberalism. As one historian argues, the Vital Center placed a ban on soft utopian thinking, reinvented the liberals' relationship to power, and in the name of liberalism seized the masculine high ground for a tradition too long associated with bleeding hearts, effete intellectuals, and striped pants diplomats. In 1951, the literary critic and New York intellectual Leslie Fiedler penned an essay about the His case for commentary, excoriating that, and I'm quoting him, American liberalism has been reluctant to leave the Garden of Illusion, but it can dally no longer. The age of innocence is dead. It was one of many essays penned by the New York intellectuals that called for a more responsible and virile and toughened liberalism. In 1948, when Henry Wallace ran for president under a third-party progressive ticket, Eliot Cohen, the editor of Commentary, heaped scorn on Wallace's so-called common man approach to world affairs, describing it as a fine demagogic flower of totalitarian politics, both on the right and the left. Cohen argued that the notion of a common man presumed that people did not think for themselves and all the individuals could be treated as a mass, and an argument that the New York intellectuals and others made about communists, which they saw as emasculating. The common man approach, Cohen wrote in Commentary, looks upon the vast majority as the masses, the untutored many, an undifferentiated glob of nameless, mindless, and will-less human beings. A lot of guys named Joe. But Cohen also warned in 1948 that, quote, no more problem faces the American people today than to learn what is left and what is right. What policies will lead to freedom and which will lead to confusion. Liberalism, that is, had not yet rid itself of its connections to the Popular Front, of Popular Front illusions, according to Cohen. Now, 4 years later, in 1952, after Senator Joseph McCarthy had come to dominate the anti-communist crusade, Irving Kristol famously wrote, "There is one thing that the American people know about Senator McCarthy. He, like them, is unequivocally anti-communist. About the spokesman for American liberalism, they feel they know no such thing, and with some justification." Now, while McCarthyism, am I running out? While McCarthyism came to be shorthand for the Second Red Scare, it was a misnomer, according to historian Ellen Schrecker, in part because the anti-communist hysteria predated 1950 when Senator McCarthy burst on the national scene and lasted well beyond when he was censored by the Senate in 1954. Now, David Reisman and Nathan Glazer, two prominent New York intellectuals, marveled at how the senator had combined, and here I'm quoting them, the image of the homosexual with the image of the intellectual, which resulted in, quote, the State Department cookie pusher trained Harvey Sissy, and I'm using their words, becoming, and I'm quoting them again, the focus of social hatred, while the Jew becomes merely one variant of the intellectual sissy, actually less important than the Eastern educated snob, with an exclamation point. So Glazer and Reisman were relieved that Jews were not the only sissies in the American imagination in the early 1950s. But this is a pretty remarkable quote in that it acknowledges not only the ways in which Jewishness was an undercurrent in the Second Red Scare, but how it intersected explicitly with gender. But I want to say Jewishness publicly was rarely acknowledged by Cold Warriors as a factor in the Red Scare. Jewish defense organizations, as well as the New York intellectuals, constantly downplayed it. And I'm just gonna, I have a quote from the AJC, I'll go in there, hopefully I don't run out of time, but the AJC, for example, the American Jewish Committee, sought to avoid any discussions of Jews or anti-Semitism in the cases of alleged communists. But when one concerned citizen in 1953 wrote to Roy Cohn, the assistant U.S. Attorney General of Manhattan, who made a name of himself prosecuting Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. And also made a name of himself as one of McCarthy's henchmen. This concerned citizen wrote, and I'm quoting her, "I always pride myself on lack of prejudice against minorities, but I would be blind if I did not take note that the pro-red or red witnesses before Senate hearings were at least 75% Jewish, and that most of the people convicted of subversion were Jews." Now, Roy Cohen forwarded this letter to the AJC, which responded that an individual's political orientation was not informed by religion or race, and that, quote, "adherence to the Communist Party or its tenets is purely a personal, individual matter." The Communist Party, the AJC wrote, tried very hard to make it appear that communists and are Jews and vice versa in order to shield themselves behind the spurious charges that the anti-communist attack on communists is anti-Semitic. I'm going to skip a little bit because I'm running out of time. But of course, the connection between Jewishness and anti-communism sort of burst into the scene with Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Okay, and I will say that the New York intellectuals, and they're arrested in July of 1950, or they're arrested in the spring of 1950. They're executed in July of 1953. And while we now know that Julius was guilty of espionage by documents that were released after the end of the Cold War, and Ethel's more debatable, at the time people debated it, right? And their supporters sort of argued that the case was an example of anti-Semitism. The New York intellectuals and the AJC and other anti-communist groups viciously sort of attacked the Rosenbergs, and they kind of made two arguments. One was that the Rosenbergs were inauthentic Jews. They were just sort of using their Judaism because communists told them to. And the second thing I think that's interesting is that they really portray Julius as emasculated, as unmanly. I sort of argue, they portray his and Ethel's writings as, middlebrow and, not that convincing. But for them, Julius wasn't much of a man because he was a communist and because he wasn't much of an intellectual. So to just conclude, during the Second Red Scare, anti-Semitism was, for the most part, an undercurrent that remained below the surface, in part because Jewish Cold Warriors publicly downplayed it. In the era that we're living in today, a second McCarthyism, as many of the journalists and scholars in this room have noted, anti-Semitism is being explicitly used as a justification for an attack on universities, free speech, civil liberties, and liberal institutions in American life that have long made America arguably the safest place for Jews in the world. So perhaps during the Q&A, we can unpack what lessons there are to learn from this earlier period. But I'll just conclude by saying that when the New York intellectuals looked back on the McCarthy era, many conceded, or some conceded, that they didn't get it right. In retrospect, we never managed to figure out a good position, Nathan Glazer told the documentary filmmaker Joseph Dorman in his excellent 1999 film, Arguing the World. And by good, Glazer continued, I mean not one that was politically defensible, but that was respectable and moral and responsive to all the complicated issues raised. And I still don't think we have one. Thank you.
While we're getting my PowerPoint, I just want to thank the conveners for inviting me. This is a new project for me about the long history of Columbia, and I'm saying the Jews, which I mean its Jewish students, its faculty, and the Jews of New York, which is the largest urban concentration of Jews anywhere in the world across the 20th century. I'm Trilling. Yep, that's me. Thank you. So I thank them for their conversations as I'm thinking this through, but I'm looking forward to everyone's comments because I hope to learn from everyone here. Great, thank you. Liberalism has a single desperate weakness, declared Lionel Trilling. The famed first Jewish professor appointed to Columbia's English department in his 1943 work on the writer E.M. Forrester. Its weakness, he continues, is the inadequacy of imagination. Liberalism is always being surprised, end quote. Indeed, the true surprise would be that Trilling's 1950 book, The Liberal Imagination, a work that spoke about the importance of literature for liberalism and that would establish his career as the preeminent literary critic of post-war America, sold over 170,000 copies. Indeed, read in the Academy and beyond more than most works of fiction of that year. The liberal imagination is most admired and is the most admired and influential work of the last century. It is a work that is not only considered a masterpiece of literary criticism, as it unpacks works such as Huckleberry Finn, the works of Henry James and F. Scott Fitzgerald, but it is an important statement about the relationship between politics and society, literature and political ideas, as Trilling emphasized in this work, quote, "In the 19th century in this country, literature underlay every activity of the mind. The scientist, the philosopher, the historian, the theologian, the economist, and even the politician were required to command literary abilities, which would now be thought irrelevant to their respective callings," end quote. The essays in this volume were actually all composed in the 1940s, and some actually in the 1930s, and they pick away at the promise and expose the limits of liberalism, challenging the complacency of a naive liberal belief in rationality, progress, that the social sciences can solve all, and asserting in its stead the complexity of human motivation. Only the imagination, Trilling argues, can give us access and insight to liberalism, which must be reflective and considered rather than programmatic and dogmatic. But as I will argue today, Trilling's argument and understanding of the limits of liberalism is not only rooted in the specific political context in which he's writing. Many people have commented about the 1950s and the chilly, what we just heard, the chilly liberalism of the Cold War era. But it was deeply shaped by his day-to-day experience of anti-Semitism. A few notes before I go on about what I mean by anti-Semitism, because I would say it's the word most promiscuously used in the last 16 months, and I think we need to be specific what we mean by it. First, I believe at Columbia, and this is when I talk at Columbia, I show this picture. Columbia is constructed, all right? This is what it looks like today. Like the academic culture at Columbia is constructed, and endemic to the culture at Columbia is anti-Semitism. At times it becomes epidemic, which we are experiencing now, but there is an endemic character to it. That's one, and I think that is actually reflective of society writ large in America. Second, as I said, I think we need to be more specific about what we mean when we say anti-Semitism. In the American context, I argue at its core, anti-Semitism is the treatment of Jews as unequal, inferior members of our community, somehow less deserving of the rights that America claims is afforded to everyone. While scholars for the last 70 years have followed these two great historians, Oscar Hanlon and John Haim, who have pursued an argument of American exceptionalism that has seen anti-Jewish animus as short-lived, of limited significance in American history. Indeed, they have measured only by violence and have identified few cases. But following their lead, American Jewish historians have overall, and this is to quote Britt Tevis, who was a former postdoc here, quote, "American Jewish historians have examined anti-Semitism largely to dismiss it as a serious, lasting problem woven into the fabric of U.S. history," end quote. Unpacking how it is woven into at different times and different places, I like to follow what David Engel has said, in that we should only use anti-Semitism when we can't think of another adjective, because anti-Semitism is so widely used. It is used to describe the lynching of Leo Frank, and it is used to describe, this is part of my larger project, this is a medical school recommendation from 1934 from the Columbia Psychology Department, where they rank all the students. It's one for all the students, in which you don't have to go through all the students, but the last line is, "The last man, Louis Ritterband, is a supercilious kike. He did not get into any medical schools, and he is the senior class president okay, and is ranked in the middle of his class. So that is also called anti-Semitism. They are not the same. And I think it should be more specific across time and space. As the life of Lionel Trilling illustrates, Colombia in the 1930s, anti-Semitism was a pernicious and persistent, as we see from that recommendation, but it is expressed in his life through two acts or types of activity: exclusion and tokenism, which is reflective of broader outright exclusion of Jews from certain neighborhoods, jobs, or schools. But I would like to add that tokenism defined his experience of anti-Semitism, meaning he was constantly reminded that he was here because he was a Jew, to show how tolerant Columbia was and liberal, for all types of faculty were employed there. So it is Trilling's experience of exclusion and tokenism, I argue, that undergirds his critique of liberalism in the liberal imagination. As he notes in the preface, quote, "In the United States at this time, liberalism is not only the dominant tradition, it is the sole intellectual tradition," end quote. Unchallenged as an ideology, he saw his mission to put some degree of doubt into the assumptions of his present time. As liberal thought retreated from New Deal liberalism to the more repressive Cold War liberalism, which we just heard about. In Trilling's view, that shift made liberalism riddled with illiberal tendencies, beliefs, and practices. And I should say liberalism in quotes, because his definition of liberalism in this book is indeed elusive. At times, it is emotional tendency. At other times, it's this intellectual tradition. At other times, it's a political movement. And at other times, it's just a way of being in the world. While most scholars have framed this book as being shaped by the politics of the time, which we just heard about, I believe, after delving into the archives, that Trilling's deep discomfort with liberalism was also shaped by his understanding of his personal experience of anti-Semitism. Indeed, we have to realize he formulated the ideas in the liberal imagination in Colombia in the 1930s and 40s. Ideas are not created in a vacuum. We need to understand Trilling's daily lived experience if we hope to understand how and why Trilling began to question and reevaluate liberalism. Namely, the promise of liberalism was always questionable to him because of the persistence and pernicious form of anti-Semitism, what I mean by exclusion and or tokenism, that he was constantly reminded of from day to day. So I'm just going to quickly map out the contours of his life, just if people don't know about who he is. And then I'm going to talk about what I found in the archives about Trilling, and indeed a speech he gave to the Jewish Student Society, which shows how deeply shaped he was by his understanding of anti-Semitism in the world and at Columbia. And then we will go on. So hold on. All right, so Trilling is born on the 4th of July in 1905. His parents are from Bialystok, so I've been thinking about him for a long time. He grew up in New York, enrolled in Columbia in 1921, and he would spend most of his professional life there. He graduates with a BA in 25, then an MA in 26. He then goes and teaches in Madison, Wisconsin. He returns in 1929, marries Diana, who we're going to hear about more, and we heard about a little before. And he returns to Columbia in 1932 to pursue a PhD in English, which he completes in 1938. Now, I don't have time to get into it, but we heard a little bit about before. All the discussions of Lionel's anti-Semitism comes from Diana's writing, which I think bespeaks of how his self-censorship and her understanding, because they clearly spoke about it, but it is deep to him, but he will not talk about it. So because I'm going to be conscious of the time, I'm not going to read all of them, but I want to just say he's in the Department of English, and this is from her when his department said that he wasn't happy with them, he would be more comfortable elsewhere. What they meant was that they weren't happy with him, and they would be more comfortable if he went elsewhere. And I'm just skipping for what it revealed. Jews were people who made the Columbia faculty uncomfortable. Freudians were people who made the Columbia faculty uncomfortable. Marxists were people who made the Columbia faculty uncomfortable. What I want to just state about this, it is, I would call this manipulative. They are telling him he's unhappy. He's not unhappy, but they are telling him he is unhappy because they are unhappy with him. So he is almost forced out of Columbia, which is very ironic because the biggest teaching prize at Columbia is named after him. So the irony of this. So he is almost forced out, but he is not. Upon finishing his dissertation in 1938, the English department resists offering him a full position. He then publishes his dissertation on Matthew Arnold to wide acclaim. But he's still not offered a position, for as Diana argued, the English department was unlike other departments because it gave no, quote, promise of breakthrough, meaning the physics department had employed actually a Nobel Prize winning Jew. The English department saw itself as entrusted with the vigilant protection of something called Anglo-Saxon tradition. It was not until this, and I'm not just going to say this, there is a dinner at Nicholas Butler's house, the president of Columbia. He is a known anti-Semite. I should say, if you go into the archives, he openly says at trustee meetings that all Jews are anarchists, radicals, they should not be here. This is who he is. But what is important, you can just read it, is that Trilling is tokenized. In order to prove to German universities that American universities are better, they are offering Trilling a position. And they do it over the summer because no one can come in for a faculty vote because they're all in their houses in Maine. That is literally said, okay? Right? And that is how he is appointed in 1938, the fall of 1938, to a position. This tokenization is indeed something he is well made aware of all the time, because after he is appointed, Emery Neff is actually the chair of the English department, and he comes to meet with Trilling to tell him that he doesn't want to be, and I'm sorry, he doesn't want him to be a wedge in the department, which means he doesn't want him pushing to hire more Jews. You are the only Jew we're going to have. Please remember that. Please stay in your place. All right? So that is the message that he got loud and clear as narrated by Diana Trilling. Indeed, Trilling would remain at Columbia for the rest of his career, teaching in the English department and helping to build Columbia's core curriculum, which, if you think about it, is these central texts in which Columbia men, up until the 1980s, learn how to be great men of America. It is circles around liberalism and understanding the triumph of liberalism and making what America is in the great country that it is. He also wrote for several New York literary and intellectual magazines that were coded as Jewish, such as the Partisan Review, in which many essays, the 2 essays in the liberal imagination, are taken from. Indeed, it's the writing in the Partisan Review in which reveals his deep belief that liberalism is questionable and it is shaped by the Holocaust. In one article that then became a chapter in the liberal imagination called Art and Fortune, Trilling links the modern artistic disgust with the human form, society, and the state with the Holocaust. He argued the extent of human depravity had been something people only imagined, and the human mind thought about what is the most depraved thing a human person can do until the Holocaust. The Holocaust forever destroyed liberal assumptions about human nature, about reason, society, and progress. Sorry, that is a quote. It demonstrated to him that depravity, not goodness, might be central to human nature. But I want to just now go to what he shared with the Jewish Student Society, and it's something about how anti-Semitism was a much more intimate and direct thing, how he saw himself and his place at Columbia. So this talk is undated in the archives. I actually think it's from 1940. And it opens with him saying how uncomfortable he is to be speaking to a group of Jewish students because he doesn't really see himself as a noteworthy Jew. Before we get to this, he goes on to spend most of the talk dismantling race as a category. And I want to just say that this is actually seen as totally radical. It makes the front page of the Columbia Spectator, okay? In which he argues that race does not really exist as a category. It sounds to us here as something that makes sense. In that age, it is totally radical. But what he does here, I'm just going to read the second paragraph. If the meaning of Jewishness does not lie largely with the action of non-Jews, where then does it lie? It is not a racial fact. It is not a religious fact to any great extent. It is not really a positive cultural fact. It is wholly a social fact. I need not specify about it as a fact, We all know what it is. Terrible persecution at its worst, serious economic and professional and social discrimination at its least. It is, of course, not a rational social fact. That makes it more, not less, oppressive. So this is what he is telling to the young students who invited him. Needless to say, I don't think you can see it as separate from his personal experience at Columbia. And then I'm just going to end with this and then sum up. The talk is not a depressing talk, but it is a real, what he would call a realistic talk. And I just end with his words. It is well, too, that you remember, even in our worst of time, and this is in 1940, we all know that the only group that is put at we are not the only group that is put at a disadvantage. Every minority that is in some way distinct is at a disadvantage. What is more, every virtuous and liberal person is at a disadvantage. If ever it should happen that the Americans see the horror of the European political events and that anti-Semitism should become active and bloody, be sure that it will become so only with the development of other movements, which will include the destruction of quite as many non-Jews. He argues, which is what he actually does in the liberal imagination, of thinking through how Jews' treatment makes us think about the treatment of other groups by, quote, liberal societies. So just some words of conclusion. In sum, as Trilling articulated in this speech to the Jewish Student Society and later in the liberal imagination, Jews are the ones who should not expect much from America despite its promise of liberalism. Trilling underscores in his talk that Jews make the promise of liberalism real precisely because they always had to live with the awareness of its shortcomings, as his time at Columbia made him painfully aware. He ends his talk this way, urging students to fight to imagine a liberalism in a way to fulfill its promise not only for Jews, but for all. This is indeed what Trilling's liberal imagination is trying to do. And I hope that my brief discussion here will make us not only think about Trilling in new ways in his work, but about anti-Semitism in America, and particularly, as I'm thinking about at Columbia. The ways in which Jews were and are treated at Columbia is a much longer topic, but we have to recognize how it was shaped by great thinkers and their works that, like the liberal imagination, that reshaped American thought. The past, we have been taught, cannot often explain the present we are living. Animus against Jews is woven into American history. It is not innocuous or episodic, but integral. As we sit here today and we think about American liberal democracy, which is in a moment of peril, unlike any that I have seen before in my lifetime, I hope that we can think together about how we write about the specificity of the ways in which anti-Semitism, both real and imagined, is being deployed now, has been deployed in the past, and how it is shaping this moment. Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to thank Professor Moyne and Professor Samuels for the invitation, and Linda and Inessa for coordinating the conference. It's good to see in the audience old familiar faces, and it was very good to meet some new friends. I suspect that when the conference was conceived on anti-Semitism and the crisis of liberalism, we did not all think that those terms were going to acquire the deep meaning that they have today. But there we are. Jewish history and the end of the liberal era. Can you hear me in the back? Yeah. I feel that we may be living the end of the liberal era. As Professor Grinberg said, Cold War liberalism was distinguished by its Jewish leadership. Let me see. Raymond Daniel Bell, Isaiah Berlin, Sidney Hook, Karl Popper, Judith Schklar, Manis Sperber, represented a spectrum of Jewish commitments and politics, albeit none of them was a traditional Jew. As a historian of both liberalism and Jewish culture, a liberal and a traditional Jew, I would like to draw the Cold War liberal legacy for Jewish history. Professor Grinberg already introduced to you the Cold War liberals. Their transatlantic intellectual networks represented the collaboration between emigres from Nazi Europe, remigres to post-war Europe, and the New York intellectuals. They were anti-fascist, sometimes socialist in the 1930s, liberal anti-communists in the 1950s, and became increasingly conservative in the 1970s. Personally, they were my cry of rebellion against religious nationalism in Israel. They remained my compass in the US Academy. I still find them instructive today. In a matter of weeks, the second Trump administration put an end to the world which they had labored for decades to build. A world that already underwent globalization and major transformations, yet retained a familiar structure and rules. The scenes unfolding before our eyes are as if taken from liberal classics analyzing the collapse of democracies. The Cold War liberals were anxious about the fragility of democratic institutions. They dreaded populism, were cognizant of the contradictions between the security state and self-rule, and were conscious of the elitism of liberal culture. They often felt overwhelmed by the dilemmas of mobilizing the public to defend democracy, not knowing if, mobilized, it would not turn into a mob. From its very origin, liberalism was torn between liberty and equality, autonomy and order, national self-determination and international law, unanswerable dilemmas from which the only escape is dictatorship. Once the historical conditions, respect for the law and for the political rules of the game, were gone, the Cold War liberals knew not what to do. In 1958, Aaron was willing to sanction de Gaulle's semi-coup d'etat. The Cold War liberals lived on edge. Theirs was, to use Judith Shklar's apt rubric, a liberalism of fears, modest, pragmatic, anti-utopian, wary of rocking the boat. It knew not how to stabilize. Is this too quick or? Oh, okay. The Cold War Jewish liberals were as secular as any generation had been. Many had no Jewish education, and their Jewishness remained subdued. They believed that only a liberal pluralist society would allow for integration in Jewish life, but they promoted liberalism on universal and not on Jewish grounds. In the aftermath of the Holocaust, national integration remained unquestioned only because there was no viable alternative. The nation-state was the only game in town. The liberals feared nationalism, but accepted it almost as a natural force. Some of them were apprehensive that, quote, America is no more immune than any other nationalistic, professedly Christian society from the contagion of antisemitism, as George Steiner put it as late as 1965. Israel began appearing the only solution. To be sure, the fledgling state touched every raw liberal nerve. It was the end result of a revolutionary ethno-national movement that made short shrift of both liberal cosmopolitanism and patriotism and claimed Jews everywhere for the national project in Palestine. It also triggered a prolonged bloody conflict that destabilized the Middle East and gave the Soviets opportunities to expand their influence. Some liberals never warmed up to Israel, and most did so only gradually. For many, the 1967 war, when they first feared that Israel was in mortal danger, then witnessed its spectacular triumph, represented a turning point. Thereafter, they made the Jewish state's fortunes their own. This represented a sea change in the liberal intelligentsia's Jewish politics, and it began a transformation of its identity that would only be complete with the next generation of Jewish intellectuals in the 1980s and 1990s. In my earlier work, I've shown how the liberal confrontations with the charge of due loyalty contributed to major innovations such as Isaiah Berlin's liberal pluralism. But advancing liberalism is one thing, inspiring Jewish life another. Liberal accommodation of Zionism gave opening only to ethno-national Jewishness. The Cold War liberals were completely at a loss about any other. When the New York intellectuals rediscovered religion in the 1970s, their inability to engage Jewish sources was quite amazing. Daniel Bell relegated his Jewish identity, a subject of guilt and pain, to his core commemoration and psychotherapy, and his religious practice to the sociology of religion, rarely, however, to Judaism. He preached religion's virtues. This is clearly an anti-liberal intervention. He preached religion's virtues. Manes Sperber went further than any of his peers in developing a diasporic liberal vision. He was looking for a secular equivalent to Jewish messianism that would speak to a world that had lost belief in God. Israel evoked in him deep emotion, but it could not solve the Jewish problem. It was cut off from the diaspora and Jewish history. It did not appear Jewish. Jerusalem was not Yerushalayim. The Israeli capital was not the heavenly city. The Jewish diaspora survived for millennia as a community of suffering, united by the memory of Churban, destruction, martyrology, and the hope for messianic restoration. The prophetic vision of a peaceful world sustained disparate communities over the ages, and the prophet monotheism prohibited deification. Jews anticipated the messianic restoration, but refused Messiah from Jesus to Shabtai Tzvi to Stalin. Jewish cosmopolitanism, messianic craving that refused false Messiah, was Judaism's contribution to humanity, the source of hope and progress, and its secret was in its suspense, life in expectation. Now, listen, if Israel were to collapse and Jews were no longer welcomed in Europe and the US, Sperber's community of suffering and memory will surely re-emerge. But he has not really bridged the secular breach. He read the anti-messianic imperative of Cold War liberalism as Jewish, but other liberal and democratic ideals remained beyond Judaism. And yet, just now, they must not. The Cold War liberals provided no resources to overcome the gap between liberalism and Jewishness. I would like to start doing so today. We live in an unusual period in Jewish history, an anomaly. For over 2.5 millennia, the Jews have been a diasporic people, used mostly to life as an imperial minority, trading cultural and religious autonomy, and occasionally a measure of political autonomy for loyalty and sometimes service. They had a sovereign state for only 80 years at the turn of the 1st century BCE. For slightly longer, yet relatively a short period, about 200 years, corresponding to the life of the liberal nation state. They enjoyed in much of Europe and the Americas equal civil rights, the great modern experiments in solving the Jewish question. The experiment reached a debacle with the rise and spread of racial antisemitism, Zionism, and the Holocaust, but seemed to rejuvenate in the post-war years. Nowadays, we have Israel, purportedly a Jewish state, and the Jews are virtually accepted universally, almost messianic times. But the traditional patterns of Jewish history are likely to reemerge sooner or later. Whether the so-called Jewish state survives politically or not, it can no longer remain, in the aftermath of the international crimes committed in Gaza, a guidepost of Jewish life for the majority of US Jews. In the history of Zionism, the issue in Palestine always put itself first, including during the Holocaust. In recent decades, Israel has been recklessly putting world Jewry at ever-increasing risk by projecting the Jews as leader in the Western crusade against Islam, now carried under the banner of a war on anti-Semitism with anti-Zionism as its major referent. In a way detrimental to their future survivals, Jews have become the avant-garde in a millenarian war with the Muslim world. The emerging Islamophobic, anti-Semitic, pro-Israel, fascist global network will progressively alienate American Jews from Zionism and Israel and may gradually undermine also their civil position in the US. They may well be next in line as the question, who is native, progressively emerges. To the majority of American, European, and Israeli Jews, the end of the liberal era is a catastrophe. The end of the liberal era signals also the end of acceptance of Jews as citizens, as a matter of course. The Jews will survive the collapse of liberal society or of sovereignty in Israel. They lived for millennia without one. But how can Jews preserve the liberal legacy? We need to re-engage the Jewish sources. Sorry, I got so excited I forgot. We need to re-engage the Jewish sources with liberal spectacle and seek to create a dialogue with them, this time initiated by liberals and not by Reform rabbis. As the Jews are the people of the Talmud, even more than they are the people of the Bible, I will turn to the Talmud to mine Jewish sources that could dialogue with liberalism. I would like to end by providing two examples of opening a conversation between liberal and rabbinic ideas, one focusing on deliberation and discourse, the other on democratic decision. Popper's and Habermas' critical dialogical public may be the foremost liberal discursive ideal, one viciously attacked by the fascist Carl Schmitt, Shem Reshaim Yirkav. Recent scholars note that the structure of Talmudic legal debates approximate modern open-ended discussion, with multiple opinions sustained, decisions rarely rendered, and both the ambiguity of the text of the Torah and the impossibility of a final ruling is acknowledged. The Talmud evidences a struggle between earlier, more authoritarian approaches seeking a unified ruling and later ones recognizing diverse approaches and multiple voices. At all points, however, a rational discussion and interpretive rules are fundamental to persuasion. Already Mishnah suggests disputes for the sake of heaven never end. The Talmud proclaims a single Torah verse has 70 faces. And a story presents Moses at Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva, not understanding a word of what he said, but comforted to hear that the ruling is according to Moses. Clearly, the discussion of the Constitution has been going on across the ages, and new ideas shape the debate and provide the grounds for ruling. 300 times the Talmud announces Tiko, let the disagreement stand unresolved, and at other times, Kashya. This is problematic. Schmitt may be exasperated by such an inefficient way of resolving disputes, but Jewish love of learning apart, this seems quite an improvement over Congress. And remember, we may no longer control Congress and need to keep debate culture alive. But decide we must, right? And democratically so. So, let us read together. On that day, when the sages discussed a legal question, Rabbi Eliezer answered all possible objections in support of his opinion. But the rabbis did not accept his view. After failing to convince the rabbis logically, Rabbi Eliezer said to them, if the halacha is in accordance with my opinion, heaven will prove it. A divine voice emerged from heaven and said, Why are you differing with Rabbi Eliezer, as the halacha is in accordance with his opinion in every place that he expresses an opinion? Rabbi Yoshua stood on his feet and said, it is written in Deuteronomy, it's not in heaven. Since the Torah already given on Mount Sinai, we do not regard a divine voice, as the Lord already wrote on Mount Sinai in the Torah after a majority to incline. Since a majority of rabbis disagreed with Rabbi Eliezer's opinion, the halacha is not ruled according with his opinion. So this was apparently quite well taken in heaven. Years after, Rabbi Natan encountered Elijah the prophet and said to him, what did the Holy One, blessed be he, do at that time when Rabbi Yoshua issued the declaration, it's not in heaven, after a majority to incline? Elijah said to him, the Holy One, blessed be he, smiled and said, my children have triumphed over me. My children have triumphed over me. The rabbinic God, it would appear, good-naturally abided by the democratic rules he himself legislated. I hope against hope that liberal democracy gets another lease of life, but this is not likely. We must begin looking for help to traditions and institutions that academics usually overlook, even avoid, to millennia-old traditions, including religious ones, and to learning institutions other than universities. Even before the fascist onslaught, the corporatization and professionalization of universities turned academic institutions away from liberal arts education and into training and reinforcing class differences. It's difficult to imagine they will discover their mission under attack. But US universities have been a top global institution only for the last 75 years, and intellectual life had existed before in seminaries and yeshivot and madrasas, monasteries, libraries, and courts. Those to whom liberalism is dear need to think how they can sustain the tradition in these new conditions, dialoguing with new traditions, working within new institutions. A new round of theoretical innovation in liberalism will not do. We've been fighting this fight for decades, sometimes honorably, but we failed miserably. The Romans have entered Jerusalem. Like Rabban Yochanan ben Zakkai in the rabbinic story, let us try and save from the empire the liberal legacy, Yavne and its scholars.
There are, as you can see, a lot of maybe tensions, disagreements among some of the speakers on this panel, but let us first turn to the audience questions, and then I'll see if there'll be time for the panelists to talk to each other. Yes, Professor?
You can call on people.
Okay. Yeah. I see Professor Bernstein. Yeah.
So thank you, all of you, for your talks. I want to ask a question that comes out of Stephen Smith's talk. One might think that liberalism has two anchors, one equal rights for everyone, and another religious toleration. And of course, they're not the same thing. The question really comes is the question of chosenness. How that thought, we heard yesterday, the new Israel, we know Hitler hated the idea of Jewish chosenness. Is the notion of chosenness, that kernel of what cannot be assimilated, and that resists assimilation, and therefore always undoes the claims of tolerance and of equal rights?
Stephen?
For me? Well, Spinoza hated the idea of chosenness and thought that was the Jewish curse in a way, not the blessing, the curse. And he thought that Jews should get rid of it, is the idea. He thought it was a prejudice, you might say, in the language of the Enlightenment. He thought it was a prejudice that Jews should get rid of as quickly and as painlessly, he hoped, as possible. And he believed, again, somewhat naively, that doing that would put an end to Jewish suffering, to Jewish persecution, and so on. But no, he hated the idea. He was, from that point of view. So, yeah.
But
What is, I don't see that.
assimilation possible?
Well, that was in one sense what he hoped. We know that it is not possible. It is possible for individuals to assimilate, but it is not possible for a people to assimilate. And I think he was naive. He starts from a standpoint of a certain kind of epistemic individualism and assumes that the world can, once we get rid of this prejudice, we can triumph over it. But in that respect, he was wrong. It was maybe a noble, in some respects, I'm willing to say it was sort of a noble delusion, but it was a delusion.
May I intervene just? It is, and it's completely correct that that type of elections, I mean, he was rather impatient with, but since he had to read the biblical text according to it, and there is a certain type of elections in the biblical text, the position of Spinoza is that the Jews were, the Hebrews, not the Jews, the Hebrews were elected, but they were elected for a particular purpose, during a particular period in history, which was actually connected with the ancient Hebrew Commonwealth. Once this Commonwealth is gone, that elections also passes, which connects nicely with what you said at the end, and that is were they to regain that sovereignty, that political power, that election may well be renewed. And the real problem here is the connection between election and political power. That's the curse of Spinoza.
Yes, please. You had your hand up.
Hi. Thank you so much for all of these engaging presentations. I have two questions. I would say one historiographical and the other strategic. The first is I wanted to query the panelists about the common idea that 1967 is a turning point in the relationship between American liberals and Zionism. And my reasons for that is that perhaps we have to disambiguate between the different Cold War liberals, because if you look at a publication, say, like Jewish Frontier, through the 40s and 50s, there's no... Zionism is part of a broader anti-totalitarian liberal worldview. It's not as if all of a sudden people wake up in 1967 and realize that Zionism is an ingredient here. So I wanted to ask, how to think about periodization, I guess, 67 versus this shift happening much sooner. And then the strategic question, I guess, is primarily directed at Professor Hacohen, but is, everyone should feel free to take it up, which is that, as Professor Hacohen surely knows, there's no shortage of liberal or secular Batei Midrash in Israel that have tried to do a liberal Talmud. It strikes me that their political results are ambivalent, to say the least. And so I wanted to ask, in light of what you could say would be like the political failure of those initiatives in Israel, why the liberal Talmud would seem to be a promising political strategy in providing an alternative, rather than, one critique of it is that it retrenches religious nationalism rather than resisting it. So I'll leave it at that.
Ronnie and Rebecca, would you like to first answer the questions?
I think it's addressed to the other panelists.
Yeah.
I think you're right that Israel is talked about more, and that sometimes 67 is overstated. I think in terms of commentary, and someone like Eric Alterman has written more about this, but I think Zionism and Israel were talked beforehand, so this idea that it wasn't there. But I do think that the emphasis and the focus wasn't quite there, at least among the commentary crowd, right? And I can't speak to Jewish Frontiers. I mean, New York Intellectual is an imagined community, and who counts and who doesn't count can be subject to debate. And I think I think you're absolutely right, and I think that's an important point to make. And I think others, also thinking about, when are people talking about the Holocaust? There was a whole debate in the historiography that it's not just 67, Hasia Diner, I was sort of saying earlier. That's right. I think when we think of those who became neocons, so that wasn't what my talk was about, but those, when Norman Podhoretz shifts rightwards, I do think that he's paying more attention to Israel after 67 and is this moment, though I do argue in the book that, some of Norman Podhoretz is such an interesting figure because his gender anxieties are so front and center, but they were there before 67. And I think that there was a concern, not in terms of Israel, but there was a conservative politics in the writings of Podhoretz and certainly his wife Dechter, not in Israel, but that had gender front and that was there. And I think when Israel, in 67, I'm not the first to say this, there's a scholar named Melanie McAllister at George Washington who sort of argued that Israel provides a model of positive militarism for the United States, like a masculinized positive militarism, right in this moment where the Vietnam quagmire is sort of discrediting America's place in the world, right? And sometimes I show my students these Life magazines. One is from 1967 of, Americans, not 1960, I don't know, maybe 1966, 1967 of Americans struggling in Vietnam, soldiers kind of losing the battle. And then there's this image after 67 of victorious Israeli soldiers. And, the contrast is there. So I think for those who became neocons, and again, neoconservatism is a complicated category, and some of the New York intellectuals who were associated with neoconservatism don't stay with it for the long durée. Neoconservatism was initially a reaction to the late 60s, mostly domestic politics, but then it's now associated with foreign affairs. But I think if we think of someone like Podhoretz in the long durée, and maybe the neocons of the Bush era, I do think 67 is a pivotal moment.
You had a question. A strategic question. The question is to you.
Oh, it's me. Okay. First, most certainly, even among the liberals that I was talking about, which I focused on those who were associated with the Congress for Cultural Freedom, there's a great variety in terms of the responses, and yes, some of them do not. Aaron was someone clearly who things were different after 1967. And this is also the case for many of the Americans, but others do not. You're absolutely right that there's across the liberal camps, there are significant variations. For example, the people who are in the those who are closer to the American Jewish Committee, right? People are there. Therefore, already in the 50s, have a commitment toward Israel. You mentioned Podhoretz. Well, he went actually to Jewish Theological Seminary, right? And Lucy Davidovich is there. And Milton Himmelfarb is there. The different kettle of fish. The thing is, you're absolutely. There's a spread here. There is a significant shift in terms of American Jewry itself. Again, the crusade to get the Jews out of Russia also plays a role, and that dovetails with 1967. Israel becomes a center in the way in which it is today, only in the post-67. And note, this is also the shift in terms of U.S. policy at that point toward Israel was not a U.S. ally or priority until 1967. People tend to forget that friendship forever was not until 1967. Okay, and the Secretary of the Congress for Cultural Freedom did not want any association with Israel. They tried to develop association with countries in the Arab world. That's one. Second question, the thing is, I think you have the answer already in the question. The reason, if the question was the liberal Talmud can go in various directions. My suspicion is that those places are attempting to develop a very liberal version of Zionism, and what you are suggesting is that type of liberal versions of Zionism is being strangled. What can I do? Then my only hope is that, of course, if it thrives in the United States, the liberal Talmud that will be thriving in the United States will be thriving in a very, very different different fashion. We have different grounds for cooperation here. Think opportunities that are being closed right now in the so-called Jewish state will be opened will be open for us here. We must take right now the leadership. There is no leadership any longer for the Jewish world.
There's one question. All right, I'll come to you, but the gentleman had his hand up. Go ahead, please.
Well, perhaps I don't need the microphone, but okay. All right. The liberal Talmud, the quotation, Professor Cohen, that you gave was selective. If that section of the Talmud, which is liberal, and a smiling God and a triumphant man in the name of liberal discussion, if we continue to read the story, what happens is that almost all the world is destroyed, so the story goes, because of the insult to Rabbi Eliezer, and his wife has to prevent him from praying. Wait a second, let me finish, because I want to make my consequence. Oh, I'm not being heard. Okay, the consequence of the story is not that the liberal tradition has been enacted, but that almost all the world was destroyed, and Rabbi Eliezer was prevented from praying by his wife because God would then be forced to take vengeance. My point is this.
What's the lesson there?
Yes, this is what I'm trying to say. What I'm getting at is if you're going to present the Talmud as this source of liberal discussion, you're missing the point that there is a narrative element to the Talmud, which is very mystical and very horrific. And this has to be acknowledged, that the Jewish tradition is a very complicated tradition. It doesn't abandon God into this vacuum of heroic joy in man's possession of life, liberty, and education. No, the Talmud, and therefore this whole discussion misses Kabbalah. It misses the real strange relationship of God to Israel, and it's a terrifying thing as well as a comforting thing. Okay. And I think the world has to know that Judaism is not this rational religion which you can describe in a moment or two.
I think this is the best example of the pilpul, of the dialogue. We know this, we're familiar with this. You just both, really illustrated this in a brilliant fashion, and I propose you continue after coffee. I'm coming to tonight, but we're going to take one more question. Sorry, I see two more questions before. Maury, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually asking questions from the remote viewers of the live stream. So first, a question for Professor Kobrin. Do you think that Columbia is uniquely anti-Semitic? Is it more anti-Semitic than Yale or any other institution? And then a question for Professor Hacohen. If we agree that the Academy may no longer be able to freely host intellectual progress on liberalism, are Jewish institutions a plausible new locus for this work? The Jewish press, a new Jewish think tank? Does the panel agree with Hacohen's thesis? That'll be the last questions because we have a coffee break waiting.
I will answer before you have. So I often get this question, and the reason I show those two pictures of Columbia, all right, is when Columbia was constructed on Morningside Heights, it was constructed without enough dorms, actually with no dorms for undergraduates. So Columbia is dependent on students from New York City, and New York City is transformed in the beginning of the 20th century by Jewish migration. And 30% of, well, it's more than that, probably 35% of high school graduates of New York City public schools are Jews in 1910. And the ones who are applying to college, it's 50%. Jews are more likely to be applying. So I do not think Columbia is more anti-Semitic, but I do believe that Columbia deals with more Jewish applicants than any other school in this period, and the strategies that it develops then shape the entire Ivy League of how you deal with one group that is overqualified, that applies, that might have different political views than the trustees of the organization of the university. And I like that you raised before the corporatization, right? Columbia deals with it first because New York City is transformed, and Columbia has always defined itself as being part of New York City. That's why they don't build enough dorms. Seth Lowe, who's the mayor of New York City and the president of Columbia, he leaves being the president of Columbia to be the mayor of New York City, says he wants every student to travel through the city before he comes to class. It will change what he thinks in class, and then when he leaves his classes, he will travel back through New York City to change how he thinks about. So it's a view of education as being part of the place you're in. And New York City is, you can't do New York City in the 20th century and not think about how Jews have changed New York City. And Columbia is one institution of New York City that was changed. So,
The answer to that question actually is you go to the University of Chicago instead.
Yeah. Before I answer the question, I just would like us all to recognize that when we answer that we are in a very privileged, although although we discuss anti-Semitism, I would like us to recognize in what privileged period in terms of Jewish history we are, even in regard to anti-Semitism. When I'm thinking about this period in comparison with every other period in Jewish history, we are very, very privileged, and we will not be as privileged in the coming period, okay? So let us first have a sense of proportion. This is one. The second response is, look, I'm realistic. I ran away from yeshiva world to the university to gain freedom. Right now I'm running back, right? These institutions will need to be in some ways shaped in a way that makes possible the retention of the liberal regime. But there is a love of learning in those institutions that is unparalleled to those of academic institutions. And there is that tradition that I was attempting to show here, and that you saw right here, right now in the audience, going on. And that's policy. And that will be kept alive.
Yeah, I'll just say something at the very end. Part of our title was Theorists of Liberalism and the Jewish Question. As many of you know, I come at these issues from a slightly different angle. I'm like Stephen, a political theorist. There is something wrong about privileging Cold War liberalism as the center of liberalism. It's a disagreement that Sam and I may have. It's about his great book. Look, when you started studying political philosophy anywhere in the world in the 1970s, it was Jack Rawls's book, 1972, A Theory of Justice, and subsequently the discussion around it, which completely destroyed Isaiah Berlin's two concepts of freedom. And then, of course, came on top of that also Jürgen Habermas's work. Now, they are non-Jews, but they continued the tradition of liberalism in political philosophy. So there is something a little bit skewed about wanting to talk about the rise of authoritarianism today and the end of the liberal project simply by going back to the interwar years while also skipping about 50 years of discussion of what this new liberalism was. And this new liberalism is redistributionist. It is social democratic. It is not stuck on the contrast between negative and positive liberty, and it believes that the state has a positive function in, reforming the economy. It has, unfortunately, it seems to have come to an end. And so what I'm asking myself is not just why Cold War liberalism came to an end, but why post-war liberalism also, reformist liberalism, also came to an end. And I don't quite know, how one can fit that together with Jewish discourse, with the dialogue, but this is just an observation, maybe in terms of bringing these two versions, current sense of liberalism together. But thank you all very much.